Well, good evening, all. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the third and final instalment of the second round of our King's Lectures. It's been an annual event. I'm Ed Byrne, the President and Principal here at King's, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you all here this evening, as I've said, for the third and final lecture entitled, in the series entitled Universities, the Economy and the State. As I've mentioned previously, one advantage of a series which develops its theme over 3 lectures, hence our subtitle, A Theme in 3 Acts, is that we can hold at least one of the lectures at a different campus. And last week, we were delighted to welcome a large audience at our Guy's campus, but this evening we return to the Strand, where we began with a full house and audience just a few weeks ago. Our distinguished speaker for this second series is, of course, Alison Wolf, Baroness Wolf of Dulwich, CBE, Sir Roy Griffith, Professor of Public Sector Management in our King's Business School and Director of the International Centre for University Policy Research within King's Policy Institute. Those of you who have had the fortune to attend one or both of Alison's previous lectures will, I'm sure, be looking forward with great anticipation to this evening's finale and the panel discussion which follows. Our concept in the King's Lectures is one of allowing time in which the lecturer can develop a profound and layered argument with a unifying theme. Building on her historical analysis of university education, Alison will look at the possible relationship between productivity growth and decline and higher education. Alison specialises, as most of us know, in the relationship between education and the labour market, with a particular interest in training and skills policy in universities in general and the medical workforce, and she is highly involved in policy debate nationally. In February last year, she was appointed as a member of the independent expert panel for the English government's review of post-18 education and finance, headed by Philip Arger. The economists, and I hope any vice-chancellors in tonight's audience, will be paying particular attention to the title of this evening's lecture, Falling Productivity and Slowing Growth. Do our post-2008 problems have anything to do with universities? Alison will speak for about 35 minutes and will then be joined by our panellists, Chris Giles, economics editor of the FT, and Dr. Augustine de Colon, senior lecturer in economics at King's, who will chair the discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker for her third instalment in this 2019 series of King's Lectures, our own Professor Alison Wolf.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. I entitled the series of lectures, Universities, the Economy and the State. And in last week's lecture, I was focusing quite heavily on the state at its best and the state at its worst when it comes to setting and maintaining higher education policy. But today, I'm going to focus quite heavily on the economy, which in recent decades, as I will be noting, has become the central focus of any discussion of universities and of higher education. But before I turn to this question, the universities, the economy, and is everything our fault, I'd like to just do a little recapitulation of what I talked about in the previous 2 lectures. Yay. I think the first thing to say and to remember is that universities have enjoyed a really extraordinary period. Not in every country in every respect, but in pretty much every country in at least one respect. They have grown enormously, they have grown enormously wealthy in many cases, and their influence has become enormous. They build buildings accordingly. As I pointed out in lecture 1, MIT is an institute of technology, but with aspirations towards classical Greece and Rome, whereas Yale goes for the other main theme in Western universities, which is the Gothic. But the point is that these are universities which are grand and feel themselves to be grand. And behind this impressive set of buildings, there is an impressive growth rate. And what I've shown you here, again for 4 of the developed economies, is the way in which participation rates in higher education have soared in the last century, less than a century, indeed quite remarkably since the end of the Second World War. And they have done so really everywhere in the world. If I was showing you, as I did in the first lecture, some comparable figures for the developing world, you would see that basically this flight to the stars is even more apparent, faster, at an earlier stage of development in the developing and in the emerging world than it is in the old first world countries. And the other thing that's very obvious, if you take the OECD average, again, it's the same thing. The percentage of adults who have completed tertiary education is enormous. To our ancestors of not that many generations ago, when the idea of going to university was a complete irrelevance for the vast majority of the population, these figures would have seemed extraordinary. The idea that more than half in many countries would not only have started but completed a tertiary education would have been quite simply unbelievable. They would have thought that we were putting up the wrong figures. This must be primary education, this must be a number of people who can kick a ball accurately, this cannot be universities. But it is. And not only that, but universities have also become absolutely central to scientific and to medical research. And they have become, and they have been seen to be, the source of innovation across the world and in countries which are extremely sensitive to and indeed desperate for the next idea, the next innovation, the thing which for the wealthier countries will keep them absolutely and relatively wealthy, and for which other countries will give them a chance to accelerate, not simply to be always in catch-up mode. The start of the research university was in the United States, Johns Hopkins, and what I think is important about this is that it was around then that the university became known as the natural home for research. The idea that universities were not just about teaching people for the professions or developing the priests who would save our souls, that idea is actually quite a recent one. It really isn't very long ago that Johns Hopkins was founded, and not really that long ago that Germany became the home of the professor in his laboratory producing research which actually fed into society and changed it. And just to bring home how enormously important the universities are in this country in its approach to innovation, to research, to science, the R&D budget of the United Kingdom, which is set to grow considerably, by the way, in the next few years, is spent to a remarkable degree by universities. The government R&D budget goes almost entirely to universities. We don't put very much into institutes. But what is so interesting is that actually over a quarter of all R&D expenditure, public and private, is spent by universities or by the Research Council and institutes. And on top of that, of course, we get QR funding, which is research-related. And we are standing in a university which encapsulates these trends. This is a university which was founded as a small institution by modern standards, though always with aspirations, and which is today one of the major leading research universities of the world, and one which has a number of students which would have been, I have to say, extraordinary, even when I was going to university, let alone when this place was founded. Now, I think the point to make is that 200 years ago, neither of these developments, the huge scale of student recruitment or the enormous scale of scientific research and the fact that it was based so enormously much in universities, looked inevitable or even very likely. The university teaching history has been at one level, it's been a very old and continuous one, but at another level, as I was explaining a few weeks ago, there have been some real bumps in the road when recruitment and enrollments actually nosedived and when it wasn't at all obvious that the university was going to be where professional training took place. And as for science, again, there was absolutely nothing to suggest in the 18th century that today science would be seen as an intrinsically university concern. So having arrived at this remarkable position, so here we are, the modern university in our pomp and affluence, if also our nervousness, I think it's worth noting that we are here in large part because the state, our governments, have decided to bet very heavily indeed on universities as the source of both prosperity and of social justice. And so what I want to ask this evening is, how realistic are their bets? How far are universities actually able to deliver on these extraordinary expectations? And just to give you a few examples, I tend to collect these, so I could go on for an hour on them, but I'm just going to give you a couple. Some people here will remember the Lisbon strategy of 2000, which was intended to make the European Union, the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. And again, if you look on that, if you look at the Lisbon strategy to which all the EU states signed up, the focus is enormously much on increasing research spending and on increasing educational attainment, and especially the years of schooling, as a way of delivering innovation, a dynamic economy. The idea is you put research in at one end and you put more and more education in, the teaching element at the same end, and out at the other end you will find competition, dynamism, and new knowledge. And, for example, one of the things that the EU states signed up to in the year 2000, which they have not all delivered on, by the way, was a substantial increase in per capita investment in human resources, which is a slightly fancy way in the context of that document to talk about education, and actually to ensuring that the number of 18 to 24-year-olds who are not in further education and training should be halved over the next 10 years. So, in other words, I showed you these graphs going right up. The Lisbon Lisbon strategy was based on the assumption that if you could continue that up, if you could put even more people into education between 18 and 24, you would actually deliver more dynamism, more prosperity, more new ideas. And UK policymakers have certainly signed up to this idea with huge enthusiasm. They have been quite convinced that this was actually something where if you increase the supply, you would actually get the prosperity that every modern government feels under enormous pressure to deliver. And I just wanted to put up two quotations, and I could find comparable quotations from many other countries. The first one is from Estelle Morris when she was Secretary of State for Education. And what she said, or what rather somebody said in a Guardian article over Estelle's name, was a 1 percentage point increase in the number of workers with higher education qualifications raises GDP by 0.5%. And there are comparable statements made in a large number of government documents, government white papers, across the last, I would say, 40 years. Now, what this actually meant was that people with higher education qualifications earned more. It does not, alas, follow that if you have more workers with higher education qualifications, the country as a whole will be richer. This is actually a relative statement, because it's based on a relative statement, which says graduates earn more than non-graduates. As I'll be explaining in a minute, it is perfectly possible for graduates to go on earning more than non-graduates while everybody gets poorer. But one of the main problems that has, in my view, occurred in making higher education policy is that too many people in government have taken a finding which is about the relative prosperity of graduates and have turned this into a magic bullet for delivering overall increases in absolute prosperity. And the second one, which is a bit of a favourite of mine, comes from the white paper Successors of Knowledge Economy, which preceded the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017. And it was based on some analysis by a group by economists who I'm glad to say were not here. And the white paper announced that research shows that doubling the number of universities per capita is associated with over 4% higher future GDP per capita. Now, I dare say that's true, and they did at least say is associated with. They didn't say doubling it will have that causal effect. On the other hand, they put this into the white paper in order to provide the indication that more and more universities continue to be an absolutely ace idea for increasing future GDP. And of course, if you read that the way that, in my view, they meant us to read the white paper, you would feel that what we probably ought to go out of here and do is divide King's up into 8 mini-universities and do the same for UCL and same for Durham and the same for Manchester. And hey, you know, we can sort out everything that's been going wrong since 2008, and it's our fault for not seeing this. Now, I'm being a bit flippant, but the point is this is actually quite serious, because this is, in fact, how governments around the world have come to see higher education. They've come to see it as a tool for delivering growth and as a tool that can be used in quite a mechanistic fashion. They have also, and on this I'm not going to start being facetious, seen higher education as a tool for equalizing opportunity and increasing social mobility. And this, again, is something which is very obvious in this country and very obvious around the world. And one of the results is, again, a rather unexamined belief that one of the best things you can do for equality of opportunity and for social mobility is to go on and on and on expanding higher education and asking those involved in it not to contribute, but actually putting more and more money into this particular sector of education in order to give people free, as in the sense that they don't have to pay fees, free access. So at the moment, for example, free college tuition is the favoured policy of almost all current contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination on opportunity grounds, and I do not want to question their genuine commitment to this. But it's also something which you get sort of all around the world. And so my other quote is from a very well-known economist, Raghuram Rajan, who was at the time governor of the Bank of India. And again, looking at India and India's woes and what might be done to improve equality of opportunity and spread prosperity, not his only idea, but one of his major ideas is that what you need to do is to focus on education. That the route to equality is to improve education, and that will be the single most important thing that you can do. But I think my favourite at the moment example of this, and the reason I put it up is because it illustrates the way in which this has become something a bit akin to magical thinking. You know, because how can one hate education? I don't know anybody who has ever regretted that they had as much education as they did. So it's very easy to fall into this seductive trap of believing that more education is the answer to your economic problems and to your problems of opportunity. And the current new president of Mexico in 2018, when he came in, promised to abolish entrance exams for universities, so anybody could go, and to open 100 new public universities. Now, his December 2018 budget actually cut funds for existing universities in Mexico, but his 2019 plans confirmed that he intended to open 100 new ones and that he intended to make higher education effectively an obligatory part of basic education. And the magical thinking is obvious. He sees this as a way of spreading opportunity in a very unequal country. He also sees it as a way of delivering prosperity. But the magical thinking also extends to the idea that you can do this while also reducing expenditure per head. So here we are. We have universities. We have been made instruments of our government's hopes and our government's plans. And in some of the world, we have actually also been given far higher resources than in the past. I mean, certainly in this country, we have enjoyed big increases in funding. America spends a large amount of money on its universities. Many of the developed world countries spend a great deal. So we've had an explosion in higher education enrollments, an explosion in the amount of university-based research. And so the question then comes, has this been a period of high productivity growth, and has it been a period of higher social mobility? And the answer, one has to say, is, well, no, not obviously. What I have put up there, with apologies to experts, is a highly smoothed version of an already smoothed version of productivity growth. And productivity is something you can define in a large number of ways, but what I've looked at there is labour productivity growth. In other words, is the amount that individuals produce per hour, something that has grown. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, I think that it's worth sort of talking this through very quickly. The light blue line is the euro area, the orange line is the USA, and the purple one is the UK. And this shows a number of things going back a century. One of the things it shows, actually, is that for a lot of the time, except for that huge peak straight after the Second World War, which I'll come to in a minute, the USA was a leader. It then had a bleak period in 1980. That was the period, I think, when US policymakers were convinced that Japan was going to destroy the US economy. It then went down, it then went up again, it then went down again. During all that period, by the way, in terms of GDP per head, nobody ever manages to catch it up unless they're an oil state. The US economy goes on being the most innovative in the world. It always, people almost catch it up, and then they don't. The euro area is, as you can see, pretty volatile. Now, there were lots of different countries under that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But if we look at this here, what you can see is that we have after the Second World War, we have what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 amazing years after the Second World War, when European productivity was just higher than anybody could have imagined. And then what you see is that it goes into a long, long decline. Now, there are lots of bumps in that I've happily smoothed out, or other people have smoothed out for me, but the reality is that not every country every year, but when you take that area, what you're getting is a long decline in productivity. And the British economy is actually tends to kind of jog along in comparison. So we did considerably less well after the Second World War. We went up and down. We went down very fast in 2008, as most people are aware, and we are just creeping back up. But I think the point about this is it doesn't look like a world in which, in the developed economies, productivity has been doing that well in the last period, the period from about the 70s, and the period in which university enrollments were not merely carrying on growing, but growing remarkably fast. And just to show you this a little more detail, because I think what it brings out is that this is not just a result of sort of putting together some high productivity and low productivity growths, that what you can see again there with some slightly different, well, not different numbers, but fitted slightly differently, is the same pattern. That basically, labour productivity growth has been pretty sickly. The trend is down. And it was before we had the 2008 shock. Not equally, not everywhere. Germany goes up and down more than where Italy, alas, has just been mostly going down. The UK jogs and then goes down. But this is not the picture of a world in which productivity is growing fast anywhere in the developed world from which our main ideas go. The places that are growing fast are the ones that are in full-scale catch-up. And just to bring slightly more clearly the question of, are we right to think that higher education is an answer to growth? What I've done there is I've taken a couple of other sources. Robert Gordon has written a very good and very depressing book, actually, about the decline in new ideas, the fact that compared to the amazing innovations and productivity growth of various other periods in quite recent industrial history, the period of the last 40 years has been quite disappointing. There was a bit of an upward flip from the IT revolution, and that has, of course, changed many things. But his argument, which some people dispute, and it may be that we are about to have some incredible breakthroughs, is that if you compare the recent past with the a little while ago past, really things have been largely slowing down. And so what I've done there is I've taken the average annual growth, this time in total factor productivity, taking Gordon's figures, and shown those as the blue columns. And the green columns are the change, so that's an average over each 10-year period. So very slow growth between 1900 and 1910, and pretty slow growth between 2000 and 2010, and really very fast growth between 1940 and 1950 on an annual basis. But what I've put beside them is the change in the percentage of the American age cohort enrolling in college in that period. So what that tells you is that although the growth in enrollment slowed a bit during the 70s, and has slowed again in the last few years, partly because so many people already go, what you've got is gigantic increases in the proportion of young Americans enrolling in college in the period after the Second World War, and doing so at a period when, as they came into the labour force, actually total factor productivity growth was slowing. So one can only say the link doesn't seem terribly obvious. Whatever it was that we thought we were going to get from having far, far more people go through university, it doesn't seem to be delivering. And the other thing, which I think is perhaps even more depressing, actually, is that in terms of social mobility, the picture is of general stability. And here I'd have to say that the scholar whose work I admire most on this is John Goldthorpe at Nuffield College, Oxford. And what he suggests, and again this is about relativities, is that if you look at the whole post-war period, what is interesting is that the relative chances of being socially mobile don't shift very much. Now, the labour force shifts, so if you were born at the right time, for example. You were born at a time when the labour force was being transformed, and although you might be born into a family of manual workers, you and your siblings and your peer group, many of you would move into white-collar and middle-class jobs, and that's absolutely true, and anybody in this room who has grown up or who lives now in a country which is fairly developed can probably think that one through in terms of their own family. You think of your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and then you think of your parents, yourself, your siblings, your cousins, and there's a shift. But what Goldthorpe says is that that's absolutely true, but the relative chances have not shifted much. It remains true that if you are born into an elite family, your chance of staying in an elite family will remain hugely much greater than the chances of somebody born into a poor family reaching the elite. And those relativities have not shifted much. So in other words, the extent to which your class origins and your cognitive ability to determine where you end up has really not shifted very much. And that's not just the UK, that's throughout the developed world. Now, this is actually quite depressing because what I've just done there is, I'm sure the numbers on the left have vanished, that's basically a pictorial representation of how we have equalized exposure to education. They're actually human capital Gini coefficients, which I won't spend 10 minutes explaining, but basically you can probably get the picture that in 1950, exposure to education in terms of access to secondary or primary or higher education was very unequal in all these, very unequal in some cases, like in South Asia, and basically in every continental area, it has become much more equal. So access to human capital has become genuinely much more equal in terms of the number of years that people get. And yet, across the world for that same period, there has been no corresponding decline in income inequality. There's virtually no correlation between a country's level of inequality in access to education and its level of income inequality. And there's no relationship at a global level that people can find between changes in educational inequality and changes in income inequality. And the same, by the way, is true for comparative growth rates. That there is no heartwarming correlation between growth in per capita income and growth in education participation rates globally. Now, this all sounds really depressing, and in a sense it is very depressing, though if we were perhaps less preoccupied with education as essentially about growing the economy, we might feel, well, there are all sorts of other things that might be going on as well. And I don't think anybody believes that education is making people less productive. But what I think we have to accept is that there is no simple or automatic route between increasing the supply of university places and increasing the growth rate. And there is no simple correlation, no simple route that says if we open new universities, our societies will become more equal and social mobility will increase. The reality is, the evidence is that this just isn't true. So bigger is not always better, and just to remind everybody, once upon a time, our economists believed that you grew by pumping up the amount of capital that you had, capital goods. So that's a Brezhnev-era combine harvester, for those of you who remember the planned economies of the Soviet Union. And that was a particularly good thing to put up, because under Brezhnev he had, well, under the whole Soviet economy, there were targets for how much capital you could pump out of the factories. Nobody ever checked whether they worked, and most of the combine harvesters, unlike these two, didn't. So the question is, why might this be? What is going on? What is going wrong? So I think a number of things are going wrong, but let's start with what we hoped was going on, and that was a virtuous circle, which basically said we educate people, they have skills. That means that they are more productive, which means that there is more economic investment comes in, employers feel that they can increase their investment, increase their plant, and these newly skilled, newly educated, productive workers will get more and more out of them, and therefore you get economic development, you get more investment in education, more skills, more economic investment, and therefore you get a virtuous circle. And of course, it's not that there is nothing to this. You cannot run a modern economy without highly skilled people. But if you get ahead of the ideas, the nature of the labour market, what you actually get is something different. And just to give you a couple of examples of what has been happening, in 2004, which was the time, I suppose, of peak belief in this country that expanding universities was the way to make everybody richer. That's about the time that that quotation from Estelle Morris was, and as I said, there were a lot of people who believed that, and in fact, some people still do, but not me. The UK lifetime pay premium for obtaining a degree at that point, compared to somebody who did not, who had not got anything beyond GCSE, was 41%. By 2017, just 13 years later, the average had reduced to 24% on ONS figures. But I think actually the United States is the most interesting and the one to sort of, in a sense, take away with you, which is that in the United States, earnings for males between the 50th and the 80th percentile, so that's the middle and the sort of the 44/5 up, their actual earnings in real terms have stagnated. Female earnings have not stagnated, by the way. But for males, between the 50th and the 80th percentile, real earnings have stagnated in that period, in this period, although the top 20% have done very well. But because high school dropouts have done even worse, you get a situation where college remains a high return choice for the individual, even though in terms of the amount of wealth and product that is being generated, one would have to assume if wages are in any sense related productivity, that nothing is happening in a large part of the labour market. So it's still super rational to go to college if you're American, but from the point of view of the American economy, it's not clear that we're getting very much for it. And we have, in recent years, very recent years, been doing some, we, Institute for Fiscal Studies mostly, has been doing some extremely detailed analysis of returns to UK qualifications and degrees. So what they say, one thing they conclude, is that graduates from almost all UK institutions earn more than those at the 20th percentile of the non-university earnings distribution. which, when you think about it, is not saying very much. 20% is 1/5 up from the bottom. So most graduates from almost all UK institutions earn more than those at the 20th percentile. In other words, many graduates are earning considerably less than most non-graduates. And what becomes very obvious is that how much graduates earn is strongly influenced by subject and by institution. And these are all IFS figures. And we can do this because it's possible. We have data sources, which means that you can link people's degree, where they went and what they took, to how much they were earning. This is actually in their late 20s. Now, I've put the male results up because the women's results are actually much harder to interpret for all sorts of reasons that I will happily expand on, probably on a different occasion. But the pattern that I want to show you is this one. Now, the black dots show how much more, on average, people who go to university earn than people who don't. And the zero line shows, the baseline which you're comparing it with. And that actually looks moderately healthy. The only people who are actually earning less than the non-graduate average, on average, are creative arts down in the bottom left corner. But if you look at the red dots, it looks considerably less good because the red dots control for prior achievement. So when you start, for example, comparing people who went to university with people effectively who have the same grades as them, but didn't go to university post A-level, it all looks a lot less dramatically worth doing. And you see that actually you've got lots of red dots, which are actually pretty close to or underneath that zero line, which is what non-graduates are getting. And the other, so this is, I think, something which we need to bear in mind, particularly given what we know about the workforce, which is that although it has become very much more professional and technical, it still does not have half the population doing professional and technical jobs. It's also true, by the way, that, as you might expect from the high returns up at the right-hand end to maths, economics, physics, as well as law and medicine, that the labour market rewards people who have quantitative A-levels very well, even if they don't go to university. So if you leave your school with good maths and science A-levels and you don't go to university, you will still do pretty well on average. And that is partly because of the diverging productivity in different parts of the sector. And what I put up there are German earnings, obviously before benefits and so on. But just looking at index wage growth in the German economy, which we always think of these days as the most fantastic one, what it brings home very clearly is that what you've actually got is booming productivity in the tradable manufacturing sector and a lot less in the others, and therefore people who don't go into those sectors are doing a lot less well. So that reflects the maths, engineering, and physics things. The other thing, which brings me to the last bit of my lecture, is the returns by institution, because what that shows is the returns by the individual university that you went to. And the top two are LSE and Oxford, and the lowest one is Liverpool Institute of Performing Arts, and that's sort of, I suppose, quite logical. But again, if you look at the red dots, which are controlling for prior achievement, what you see is that there are a large number of institutions that are really pretty close to that zero line. In other words, the institution that you go to makes a huge difference to the likelihood that you will do well in life. Now, this is not something that surprises any of my students, I have to say. If I ask them, why do you come to King's? What is it about King's? Is it because you think our teaching is fabulous? And if they're being honest, they say, well, we hope the teaching will be fabulous, but basically you're highly ranked. So it also means the pressures to stay highly ranked are pretty great. So this, I think, is really a very interesting and also very depressing graph. And it goes with the fact that we have got labour markets that are actually not hungry for 50% of graduates in and of themselves, though they may use it to rank. And it's where I want to end, which is with a story of signals, because it seems to me that we have to accept that in a world where we are sending so many people to university. A lot of what is going on is hopefully skills transmission and teaching and indeed research, though the productivity picture does also suggest that we are getting diminishing returns on research. But what we are also getting here to a very large extent in the economy is the use of the institution that people go to send a signal to the labour market of whether they are more or less intelligent, more or less diligent, more or less on top of the way the world works. And this used not to be the case. It used not to be the case that universities were a way of getting beyond the first stage, of getting through to the point where you actually could do the online application, the point at which you could actually apply to the job. As recently as 1950, as far as most employers were concerned, university graduates might include some of the most high ability people, but most people didn't go to university, so there were a lot of high ability people who didn't have degrees, and you went out and looked for them there. By 2000, before the latest upturn, we already were at a position where about a third of people had degrees. And at that point, you start using it to filter. And at that point, you also have enormous pressure on everybody else to go, because at that point, you start having a large number of occupations which become graduate only. Don't bother to apply if you don't have a degree. If you want to get on the shortlist, you must have a degree. Degree only. No non-graduates. And of course, we're not quite there, but South Korea is pretty much there. You then get to the point where basically people feel it's not that going to university will guarantee me a great job, but not going to university is going to be the most high-risk possible thing that I can do. And so you actually get a change from the university's traditional position, which is the tip of a highly selective pyramid, to today's very clearly differentiated hierarchy of tertiary institutions. And I think that there are a number of questions we have to ask ourselves. Because what I think it shows is that while it is not in any obvious sense the university's fault that things have not got better since 2008, the record of our labour markets, the record of productivity, the record of social mobility is one that says our institutions have not been able to live up to the unrealistic, but nonetheless global expectations that governments have developed for them. Governments have poured money in, believing that this was a silver bullet, and it isn't. Now, is our globalized higher education system stable? I would say short-term, yes, for all the individual reasons that I've just outlined. For an individual, this still makes complete sense. Why would you not go to university? Why would you not try to go to the best university that you can? And in the process, you will, we hope, I believe, also get an education which in other respects will be something that you value. As I said, I think that don't think I've ever met anybody who wished they had been less educated than they are. Indeed, the current, but is this a good economic policy? Is this something where we need more of the same? That's something else. My sense is that the current dynamic looks set to deliver yet more of the same, yet more obsession with the economy because governments don't have any other ideas, and yet more obsession on parental part with getting their children into the best university possible. And I guess most people have seen the most recent scandal in the United States about paying to get your kids into a top grade. But you know, this is, okay, so it's the extreme point, but it's a manifestation of a global phenomenon. And, you know, one of my other favourite sort of anecdotes is that Chancellor Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, presiding over an economy and a country where other parts of the system were great, but the universities were not great, sent his two sons to university in America. So is it stable? Short term, yes. Is it just? Is it fair? No, it clearly is not. And is it efficient? And I think the answer to that has to be no, too. And that, I think, is the threat, not to the size of the sector, not to the raging competitiveness of the sector, but it is a threat to the quality of higher education. because finance ministers are increasingly aware that they are not actually getting as much bang for their buck as they'd hoped for. And finance ministers are not renowned for sophisticated policy making, and I think the biggest threat to the quality of education in our world is not that universities will be closed down, but that actually they will become more hierarchical, more underfunded in most cases, and therefore, if anything, less just, less fair, and possibly less efficient than they are today. On which gloomy note, I will leave you and ask for my panelists to come up and join me and tell me whether they think I was talking nonsense. Thank you very much. Is somebody going to... Is this on? It is on. Okay, well, I'm delighted to, as Principal has already intimated, to welcome Chris Giles of the FT and Augustin de Coulon, who is my good colleague in the business school here at King's. And I'd like to first ask each of them to respond and say a little bit about what I missed out, what I got wrong, and then we will throw open for comments and questions to the floor.
Shall I kick off? Well, thank you, Alison. And I wanted to say, first of all, that I thought the lecture series, and I've been to all three, were both wonderful and wonderfully depressing. Essentially, if I use a slight journalistic skills, I'll just sum it up in a sentence, that universities are an amazingly successful institutions stroke businesses that have grown, sucked in government money, and as Adair Turner said of the banks about a decade ago in the crisis, they are socially useless. Their function really is to offer signals about how good the students are, which they do on admission, and they don't do much else for the economy afterwards. So I think the implication, I think, from Alison's lectures is maybe we should stop this, or at least curtail this terrible arms race that we're getting ourselves into. So I wanted to point out some things in favour of her argument, and then some things, some counter-arguments that you might make. So 3 arguments very quickly in favour. The decline in the wage premium for going as an undergraduate to university, certainly in this country, is pretty well founded now. We're seeing it. Alison put up some of the figures, but other ones also from the IFS, that at the end of your 20s, the male wage premium now on average is 6% for going, and that's spending the £30,000 roughly to get a 6% wage gain. 30% of men get no wage premium whatsoever for going in, then relative to what that sort of person would have got outside. For women, it's much more favourable on this sort of percentage terms, about 26%, but that mostly says more about what women who don't go to universities do and their wages in the labour market, rather than the wages for women in the labour market. Essentially, that women who don't go to universities tend to have children much earlier, so by the late 20s they get what we sort of know as the motherhood penalty in the labour market, which is still pretty, where there isn't at that stage a gender penalty, but there is a motherhood penalty. So the decline in wage premium is very clear and is happening. Secondly, productivity growth is very much a problem in this country, and what's not great for the university sector, now I'm not going to make any causal links because causal links are very difficult, but the associations are that where productivity has performed worst is at the top end of the labour market. It's actually the top sectors and the top jobs. It's not that productivity is falling in those sectors, but it's not growing as it used to. It used to grow at sort of rates of 5-6% a year in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's down to sort of 2% a year, and everyone in those sectors has gone to university. So universities are not, or the labour market, stroke universities, the outcomes for people in those top sectors are not as they were, and that has an effect on the whole economy. And all of this is very expensive, and we've hidden the cost of universities in our government finances, something that will not happen come later this year, where the government budget deficit will increase by between 10 and 13 billion pounds a year as we account for the cost of universities, and that's essentially the cost of the loans that have been offered for both for tuition and for maintenance that haven't been showing up in the government books but are going to be shown up after finally the Office for National Statistics has got its act together and worked out a technique to show the write-offs that will ultimately occur in real time. So I think all of this is are cases for why we do need to be worried, just as Alison said. Just a few arguments why we might be less worried than we should be. It could be worse. If we hadn't had the expanded universities, we don't know what the counterfactual would be. We might have a much, an even worse productivity performance. Maybe the signalling effect is actually very valuable for society. We need universities. Getting into a very good university is a great thing. Universities put a lot of effort into this, and is this such a bad thing? I think some of what we've seen in the subjects suggests that it isn't all about signalling, that obviously the labour market isn't perfect, but that you do see, it's not that every subject you see the same returns to suggests that there is some, at least there's some variation in the returns which suggests that you are learning something in those subjects. And then very importantly, it's not all about money. We have to say that you learn a lot of other things at universities. Maybe civil society is a much better place than it otherwise would have been if we didn't have as many graduates as we do today. And just one final thing is that we might have the causality all wrong. And it might be that because we're rich, we like to have 3 years or so and pay for it as a consumption good. That we're consuming is essentially a long summer camp for 18 to 21-year-olds. The idea that you became adult at 18 was a very short period, and maybe this is something that parents and people just pay for because we as a society are rich enough to be able to indulge ourselves like that these days, and we couldn't in the past. So that just turns the causality entirely on its head, and I think you need to think hard about causality and not dismiss things like that. So that's all I really wanted to say. I think these are all very difficult questions. I don't have great answers, but I think Alison has done a fantastic job at posing the questions, and it's not always a comfortable job, and that is actually the purpose of higher education, to ask difficult and often uncomfortable questions. So thank you.
Thank you. I would like to join Chris to congratulate Alison for a really insightful and thought-provoking, as we would expect from her, discussion talk. I will make only 3 points. Some of them relate a bit to what's just been said by Chris. So we'd like first to reassure some of the students who might be in the room from the MSc in public policy and management, an MSc that Alison has created around 10 years ago. So if we look at those really bleak pictures of decreasing return to basically a decreasing productivity growth, we still need to keep in mind that actually the overall picture is that in 1960, GDP per hour was producing $15, and in 2018, it's producing $55. So the rate of growth, productivity growth, has gone down, that's for sure, and that's very deplorable, especially accompanied by increase in education enrollment. But still, we are far more richer than we were in 1960, and that's the rosier story, and probably education has contributed a bit to that as well. What is really worrying me is the fact that we live in a country which was growing at very fast productivity growth in the 60s. In the UK, we were basically at the top. And we are close to the bottom at the moment. And that's a worrying developments. We don't really understand. There are, of course, a lot of work done, especially at the LSE, trying to assess the causes for those lower productivity growth in the UK and why it's gone down so much faster than in other countries. Now, the second point I wanted to make is, again, to do with how Alison, you relate increase in education that didn't really help much improve income mobility. That, to my view, and basically lower return to education, to graduate. So if in a world where we move to 50% of the cohort getting a degree, of course the variety of topics being delivered for a degree is bound to become very large, and then you are going to probably naturally generate graduates who get degrees who don't do so well on the labor market. Now, the premium, as you said, Alison, to more mathematical topics is kept growing. It's still really high. That's why, again, we told to our MSc students, do those math exercises. They will be useful on the labor market. And it's clear as well the inequality has increased at the top, of course, because you can have a PhD in different areas, and depending on which discipline you do it, you're going to get a huge pay increase or not. Now, the last point, and obviously you know where I'm coming from, Alison, so we've been talking about university, 52%, but what about the other 48%? So we've got 48% who are not going to university, and I suspect most of the productivity, addressing the problem of lower productivity growth could actually be coming by trying to improve vocational education and basically access a better transition for kids, for the 48% kids who leave school at 16 or 17 and who don't go to university. And this is still half of the cohort. And so we don't really speak about him as much. Alison and a couple of us are involved with the Center for Vocational Education. And so we're trying to raise this in the agenda. You have, of course, your vocational review. But I come from a country where vocational education, that's not France, it's Switzerland, where vocational education is a way to promote intergenerational mobility. So you've got numerous examples in this country of children who left school at 16, engage in vocational education, learn the math and the algebra they couldn't learn at school, but they do learn it on the job, and they do extremely well. Not all of them, but some of them. So yeah, I wanted to speak a bit about the vocational education as well.
Thank you very much. Of course, we could all be as productive as Switzerland. We'd all be fine. Thank you very much to both of you. And now I hope somebody is going to take the roving mics. And I'm conscious that some people have probably sat through 3 lectures, dying to say something. So we do have a few minutes for questions and comments, though if people could please keep them fairly brief. And what I suggest we take 2 or 3 and then respond and see how we're doing.
Martin Wheel. I wondered, whether what you're describing is actually the logical outcome of a long-term development. 25 years ago, I remember finding that if you had sort of middling A-levels and you did a history degree, your premium over a non-graduate was more or less 0. Now, as more people go to university, so the
mean wage of the non-graduate presumably goes down, that sector is depressed. But is what we're seeing simply that more people are going to university and we're getting more of what 25 years ago were the history graduates with rather middling degrees who hadn't been to public schools?
Thank you for brilliant lectures and also for the panel discussion. I just wondered whether if you might think about, Alison, changing your unit of analysis from universities to subjects within universities. Because you said, I think, if I've got it right, that your argument would be we're going to get an even more differentiated university system, with the standard ones at the top and the standard ones at the bottom. I wondered if we had a slightly more differentiated system now, and I can't remember the date, but there was one government who talked about pockets of excellence. And these were pockets of excellence in universities weren't traditionally regarded as the highest, high up on your ranking list. And I think I've come across said pockets of excellence in universities that probably some of us would think weren't very high in the ranking, but had actually really brilliant departments that specialize. I don't know how they did it, but they also brought in very good vocational students, and they worked in their area, and they became very, the top class in that. And then so you would get your Oxbridge grad, not going to Oxbridge, but rather going to this university to study that subject because of the innovation of a particular department. So I'm trying to be a bit more positive, to think I'm a university academic, that I could do something about things in my little area by actually really working very hard in my community with those less fortunate, not likely to go, and also doing very good teaching as well.
Hi, my name's Jo Marchand. I work in the widening participation team here at King's. So universities are under a lot of pressure from the Office for Students to close the gap in access between the most and least affluent students. And we've been recently tasked with, we've got 20 years to completely close the gap now. And given the amount of resources which are being put into widening participation, and given the data that you presented, which suggests it might be a misguided policy, I just wanted to get your response to that.
Okay, shall I start? Well, let me start first with Martin. Well, if universities were teaching people things that were of huge labour market value, then one feels that the return, there should still be at least some positive return. I mean, obviously it's likely to be a mixture, but the implication of your question was that doing history never really added much to your labour market value over and above what you had from both a general education and from your signal of your grades earlier. I do believe that universities can and do teach important things, though, as I said, I don't think they can transform the labour market. And I think that one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is whether there is a large part of the labour market, or a large part of the university sector now, which actually is indeed not adding anything, and therefore part of this is simply because we're just going down the distribution, and that's bound to happen to some degree because these are relativities. And so I think one of the questions that we don't ask ourselves enough is, do we actually teach anything really useful? Do people actually learn anything that changes them while they're here? I think they sometimes do, and this actually comes back to the point that Celia made. I mean, of course, there are individual places and individual centres which are doing extraordinary things. But the nature of the beast is that this has become a huge self-perpetuating, I don't want to call it a monster because I hope there's a lot of education going on, but it has become very, very large, and it has become a huge sector which is not doing what the people paying for it hoped for. And then the question becomes, at least some of that money be better spent elsewhere. And that comes to Augustine's point that I'll pass over to him again, which is that if we are spending huge amounts of money on universities, and if we are putting people in a position where they feel they have to spend large amounts themselves, is this actually the best that we can do? The widening participation thing, I actually think what's being asked of universities is completely impossible. That doesn't mean that I don't believe in widening participation. I believe in it passionately, and I believe extremely strongly that we can and should do much more to make our secondary schooling more equal, and that there is huge room for improvement there, that the gaps don't need to be as great as that. But I do actually think that governments are unrealistic, and that I honestly don't know what will happen, because I think that what is being asked is impossible, and the reality is that everybody wants social mobility unless it involves their own children being downwardly mobile, at which point they will do anything it takes to prevent that. So I actually think our widening participation people at King's do actually a truly amazing job, and not just because I know them. And I do think it's important, but I think that there is a facile expectation that you can simply have totally equal attainment and entry at 18 in a world that is deeply unequal, and that is an unreasonable ask.
I don't want to use up lots of time. I just think on the last point, I think we have a tendency in all aspects of education to expect whatever institution it is, whether it's university or secondary schools or primary schools or even nursery schools, to solve other problems of society, that these institutions are the place where problems can be solved, and quite a lot of them can't. I'm a chair of governance of a very small primary school, and we do a very good job, I think, but we don't equalise. We equalise as much as we can, but in the end we still have a gap between people at the sort of in lower socioeconomic groups and higher socioeconomic groups, partly because those parents are doing a lot more work at home, and so the school can't solve all of society's ills. And as a father with a daughter doing GCSEs this year, I know that I'm part of an arms race as well, and will be doing a lot to make sure she does as well as possible, because I understand how the system works. And it's quite hard for other families to maybe use as many weapons as I might want to use.
Yeah, actually, going on as a father of a son who is doing GCSE this year, I have been actually looking a bit more recently in the direction of what is its difference with the fact with being an adolescent. And there is this really interesting work by this neuroscientist at UCL called Sarah Jane Blakemore, who is looking at the brain development of teenagers. I hope we don't have any teenager in the room. And basically, I've come to the conclusion that we spend a lot of money not only on university teenagers, but as well vocational teenagers, but we lack a bit of an understanding of how different they are and how their brain develop differently, and that the importance of role model for them is clearly something we have not been considering enough, especially for family where there is only one parent at home. So that's something I think we should be, as a policymaker, thinking a bit more.
Shall I take one or two very quick questions? It'll have to be very quick, because 5 minute maximum, and then everybody needs a drink. Somebody up there?
Has the education system had impact, has the university expansion had impact on the education system for people doing what were previously non-graduate jobs, such as nursing, trade skills, electricians, and so on? And has, if one takes into account the subsequent studies of people in law, accountancy, or business, does that explain some of the differences between subjects?
Hi, I'm Anna Williams from the Sutton Trust, so it's been very interesting to hear this evening. I suppose I wondered what you thought, Alison, or others, about the Scottish system then, with the cap on numbers, but with specific widening participation mandated targets, where that means that at a certain point, all the upwardly mobile won't get in. You put it that way. And in the interest of disclosure, I have teenagers doing GCSEs and A levels.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm an economist at Deloitte. So much of the analysis that you shared with us today frames it as a supply-side problem, in that we've got an oversupply of graduates and they aren't quite delivering the rises in productivity growth that we'd hoped. But is it possible that there could be something that is wrong on the demand side too? Is it possible that with the rise of especially winner-take-all markets, where we have certain industries where certain firms dominate those markets, there's actually a shortage of jobs that can deliver the kind of productivity growth that was perhaps delivered in the 50s and 60s with education?
Right. I might leave the last question to Chris, but can I just say very quickly, going back, that one thing which I do think is true, and this relates to going to the Scottish system, where they are demanding tremendously much of universities in terms of entrance classified by social class. I think that in the end it's pretty hard to run a country's system against the interests of its elite, brutally. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Scotland, where there is indeed a combination of a continued cap on numbers at university with very, very demanding targets for entry into the universities. And I know the universities are not at all sure how they're going to cope with this. And this is just a political observation. It's not whether it should be the case or shouldn't be the case that it's hard to run things against elite interests. But for the same forces that have driven university numbers up, which come very much from individual parents wanting their children to have opportunities, are hard to control. I do actually think in other respects Scotland's doing a much better job, by the way, in terms of its vocational HNCs, HNDs provision. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see sort of what happens there. The other question, I mean, I think one of the things that's been interesting is again, pressure from occupations to turn themselves into graduate occupations, because these are seen as having higher prestige. I think it's hard, again, to reverse that, but it's something we have to try very hard to do, because there are a lot of things which actually are not taught best in universities. There are things that universities are good at teaching, and there are things that universities are not good at teaching. And electricians so far have not decided to become a graduate occupation, and they still earn pretty well. But I think that this is something which a government has to grapple with. And the final point, of course, is that what people get paid is not ever very pure. There's lots of rent, there's lots of monopoly, there's lots of barriers. But over time, in bulk, it's as good a signal of productivity as we've got, and nobody's come up with a better one.
I'll just focus on that last question. I think it's unlikely that you could have a winner-takes-all society, which you're sort of essentially saying there's some sort of monopoly or rent power in certain industries. That is, for the people in them, they'll do very well, but then for society as a whole, there isn't enough of them. I don't think it's hard to think that that's big enough to counteract the bigger trends that we've seen across degrees for 40% of the cohort of 21-year-olds, to think that that is such a change. And there's some evidence to say that maybe it's slightly exaggerated, the winner-takes-all economy as well. There might be a different point, which is also on the demand side. Maybe we just haven't been running the economy hot enough, and that has had an effect on productivity. I mean, this is one, a legitimate question to ask. Again, I would tend to be on the side that says I'm not sure that's true, but I think that is definitively a legitimate question. Maybe we haven't done well enough as a society in our macroeconomic policy and run the economy hot enough to get the productivity growth that was open to us all that's a good question out there, but I don't have a good answer to it.
Well, I would just answer a little point on that, which is to do with turnover of staff in this country. I'm always struck by how much people celebrate when they leave their job, and after 6 years, and they say, "Oh, I've been here so long. Now it's really time to move on." I mean, in other country, 6 years is you're still a new member of staff. So there is this idea, the work for life, sort of job for life, is disappearing in many countries as well. But I think it's disappearing so fast here, then that could be a bit of a problem of causing difficulties in basically investing in job-related skill.
Well, in conceiving the King's Lectures, arguably the most important series of public lectures in our annual or in our academic year at King's, we had hoped that the lecturer would cover an important topic and would develop new material, which of course is a huge amount of work for 3 public lectures of this type. And to be able to deliver a coherent series of lectures, each of which builds on the last, but is worthy of attention for the audience member who can only attend one of the 3 lectures, is a huge amount of work. Alison Wolf has done that in spades, has delivered some superb lectures over the last 2 weeks. I'd like you to join me in thanking Alison and the panel. Could I also ask you to thank Julie Thomas, who does all the hard work to organise the series?